In the space of 6 years, Adolf Hitler had managed to crush all opposition, give himself full powers, annex Austria, and dismantle Czechoslovakia. He had finally declared war on the Jews, whom he banished from German society. A year earlier, he had invaded Poland, which he divided up with Russia. Hundreds of thousands of Jews were locked in the ghettos. In the spring of 1940, after attacking Norway and Denmark, he was preparing to invade France.
Musstet als Partei in der Minorität.
Die Maginot-Linie ist durchbrochen. In Stunden hatten auch diese französischen Panzerwerke vor Sedan den Mythos der Unverwundbarkeit verloren. Das deutsche Schwert hat hier ein neues Blatt Geschichte geschrieben. Aus dem verheißenen Siegeszug ist inzwischen ein Elendsmarsch geworden. Auch hier wieder die Kulturträger der Grande Nation. Neger, Inder, Weiße, Schwarze, Braune und Gelbe. Diese Horden sollten wieder, wie 1918, im Namen westlicher Kultur und Zivilisation auf das deutsche Volk losgelassen werden.
The French High Command was completely overtaken by the speed of the German tanks. How, in just 5 days, could they have broken through a continuous front considered unbreakable by French strategists? The French no longer had the military strength to prevent the Germans invading 3/5 of their land. Paris was declared an open city and fell without a fight on the 14th of June. Nearly 8 million French fled before the enemy's advance. The French government, too, went into exile. By leaving Paris, the Prime Minister ceded his position to Marshal Pétain. Pétain immediately arranged a ceasefire and demanded an armistice with Germany. France was split into 2 parts. 3/5 of the territory was occupied by the victor. The rest, separated by a demarcation line, became a so-called free zone. On the 28th of June, a few days after his victory, Hitler arrived in triumph in Paris.
The French position was a unique one. France was the only country defeated by Germany that was given an armistice. The French have their own authority, and this was what Hitler wanted. And he didn't want to spend manpower and money on running France. Hitler wanted to have a regime that would not demand a large number of German occupation troops when there were French people who were willing to do it for him. The German authorities were not particularly interested in what Vichy France did with the Jews who were living in the unoccupied zone. That was the business of the French.
In France between the wars, the number of Jews was estimated at around 300,000. 1/3 of them were French. The others were immigrants from Eastern Europe. 1/3 of these immigrants were Poles, who on the eve of the Second World War had chosen France, the ideal land of liberty, and in particular Paris. The Jewish immigrants settled in the Belleville and the Marais districts. Their shop signs were in Yiddish, but their children were all at French schools.
The majority of foreign Jews were Polish, people who arrived in the 20s and 30s, driven out by all the hardship and the hidden anti-Semitism in Poland, by the lack of opportunity, etc.
France was one of the most generous countries in the world with respect to refugees in the 1930s, at a time when the United States refused to enlarge its quota, and Britain imposed strict limitations on the arrival of immigrants. France opened its doors in its traditional way, and large numbers of Jews came into France and set off a powerful hostile reaction. And it was believed that the Jewish refugees would take jobs away from French people. There were pamphlets written about la guerre juive, the Jewish war, the war that the Jews want to avenge themselves against Hitler. There was the arousal of hostile feeling that France had taken in too many refugees, too many foreigners, and there was talk about a statute, the need for a statute, the need for special regulations about the place of Jews in French society.
The Statute of Jews particularly affected the French Jews. They were banned from a lot of the professions: the civil service, medicine, the law, architecture, commerce, industry, the crafts, directing companies, any of the financial services. They could no longer be students, and were not allowed to work in the press, the cinema, the theater, or the radio.
The French Jewish statute of October 3rd, 1940, was undertaken without direct German pressure. It was the product of Vichy's own policies, without reference to the Germans. There is no trace of direct German pressure.
The Germans didn't ask Pétain to pass a statute of Jews. I was able to make public this document with Pétain's own corrections that aggravate the situation of the Jews. Those who drew it up hadn't excluded teachers from the public sector, but he, of his own accord, classified them as forbidden to work. So we have to face it, Pétain was an anti-Semite.
Marshal Pétain was particularly vigorous in his wish for a statute of Jews, and this seems to be vindicated in this document.
Basically, the French Statute of Jews was, historically speaking, much more racist than the Statute of Jews or the laws of Nuremberg of September 1935. That's the big difference.
The Nuremberg laws weren't applied in France. The rules were different. They were a close copy, but à la française.
The German ordinance defined Jews in terms of religion. If one had two Jewish grandparents, the criteria was somewhat more stringent in the Vichy zone than in the German zone.
They weren't intended to imitate the Nazi laws, but the two statutes of Jews were a part of the traditional French anti-Semitism, and they would lead to ever more drastic and dramatic forms of exclusion.
The first measures, that's to say the statute of October 3rd, and the law of the following day, October 4th, which gave the prefects the authority to put foreign Jews or Jewish refugees into camps in the southern zone.
The camp at Gurs in the south of France was built in 1939 to take in Republican veterans of the Spanish Civil War. After the armistice of the 22nd of June 1940, it was used as an internment camp for foreign Jews living in France, as well as German Jews expelled by the Nazi regime.
On an occasion, Pierre Laval used to say to Ambassador Abetz, look what we're doing, we're solving the Jewish problem in our country just as you are in yours. Now, in 1940, when the Vichy regime was set up, the German policy toward Jews was expulsion. Nazi Germany wanted to push out as many Jews as possible, particularly the foreign refugees from Poland and elsewhere, but also Jews of German nationality.
There is no plan to exterminate the Jews, to physically destroy the Jews. In 1940, the only policy is deportation. The Foreign Office has a brilliant idea to use the French island of Madagascar as some kind of colony for the Jews, a dumping ground for the Jews. And Heydrich tells Eichmann he wants an SS plan for Madagascar.
The idea was to deport around about 4 million Jews to Madagascar in an enormous reservation under SS control. It would have been genocide by another route. And that idea was taken seriously for a while in the summer of 1940, but then could not be put into practice because, of course, although France had been defeated, the Germans were unable to defeat Britain and therefore unable to send the Jews overseas down to Madagascar.
When the Madagascar plan fails, some Jews are pushed from the Saar, Baden, into France.
And in fact, in October 1940, the very same week when Marshal Pétain shook Adolf Hitler's hand at Montoire-sur-le-Loire, 6,000 German Jews from the Rhineland and Westphalia were expelled into the unoccupied zone, into Vichy France.
At 4 in the morning, 3 Gestapo officials hammered at our door. Come on, take whatever you can carry. You have the right to take 100 Reichmarks and no more. A little van took us, along with some of our neighbours, to the station. We were shut up in the station all day, 1,000 of us. 9 trains came in, and they loaded us on. 6,500 people in 9 trains. Everyone was very scared. We wondered if we might be going to Poland. We didn't know where we were going. We had no idea.
In Warsaw, the ghetto was hermetically sealed, ever since November 1940. Surrounded by 18 kilometers of walls several meters high, topped with barbed wire. Within these 300 hectares were crammed 130,000 people per square kilometer. The only link with the outside world, a tramway reserved just for Poles, not Jews.
The effect of pushing Jews together in these cities like Warsaw and Łódź, is catastrophic. Overcrowding, bad housing, bad sanitation, malnutrition.
Add to that 100,000 people who'd come in from elsewhere, and you had overcrowding and dreadful living conditions. People thrown out of their villages couldn't work and couldn't make a living. There were often 15 people living in one room. In the daytime, they were out in the streets looking for work or for food.
The living conditions in the ghetto were gradually dehumanizing the Jews, and all the hardship, all the filth and the grime were gradually turning the ghetto Jews into the image that the propaganda always promoted of them.
Zurück nach Polen. Das schwierigste Problem, vor das sich unsere Zivilverwaltung in den besetzten Gebieten gestellt sieht, ist die Judenfrage. Dieses ostjüdische Untermenschentum hat seit jeher Westeuropa das internationale Verbrechergesindel geliefert.
The absolute cynicism of this footage was that it obviously set out to portray the caricatures of Nazi anti-Semitism and to exploit all those consequences of the politics of ghettoization and attribute them to a sort of degeneration of the Jewish race.
The aim of these films was to give an image of the Jews which would later justify the politics of extermination.
The Germans believed in the power of film. Hitler, he understood the power of propaganda. He had a masterful minister of propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, and periodically the Nazis made major films of propaganda.
The exclusively anti-Semitic films were produced in the 40s, right after the outbreak of war.
The two principal Nazi propaganda films orchestrated by Goebbels were The Jewish Peril, a so-called documentary, and Süß the Jew, a fiction by Veit Harlan.
Veit Harlan was known for historical pageants and big screen spectacles, and for the seductive power of his actors.
He appealed to the public by his use of big stars and all the resources of historical drama. He made melodramas that were a real cinematic adventure for audiences. It showed how an Aryan community, hitherto protected by keeping out the Jews, is perverted and destroyed from the inside by the Jewish virus, which was precisely the Nazi message.
Ich sag, was will der feine geutige Pinkel bei uns in Oppenheimer? Meinst du Geld? Nun nicht.
Fabelhaft. Wunderbar. Also ich wage gar nicht zu fragen, was es kostet.
50.000.
Aber ich sage dir doch, mein Herzog hat nicht so viel Geld.
Gut, 10.
Und die restlichen 40?
Man kommt ins Geschäft.
Nach Stuttgart kommt kein Jude rein.
Herzog. Wenn mich braucht, dann soll mir auch die Permission verschaffen, zu ihm zu kommen.
Veit Harlan's idea was to film in the Lublin ghetto because he wanted documentary footage to insert into his film. Unable to do so, he then proposed to bring extras to Germany for the shoot. Goebbels refused on the grounds that they shouldn't bring Jews in for a film about how Jews should obviously be thrown out. So finally he gave up the idea and shot the footage in Prague at the synagogue with Jewish extras who were forced to play themselves on screen.
The anti-Semitic message of this film was obvious to everyone. Goebbels had decided that they shouldn't use the anti-Semitic angle to promote the film, but rather sell it as a drama. He knew its anti-Semitic message was strong enough that it didn't need to be presented as propaganda.
Sus the Jew was a huge success, whereas Der ewige Jude, the Eternal Jew, was a flop.
The Eternal Jew put over the image of the Jew as seen by all the propaganda. You see footage of the Warsaw Ghetto, you see images of a starving Jewish population, and the whole thing's telling you, there, that's what Jews look like.
Mit den Krankheiten der Völker machen sie ihre Geschäfte und darum sind sie bestrebt, alle Krankheitszustände zu vertiefen und zu verewigen. So ist es in Polen, so war es in Deutschland. So haben die Juden es in ihrer ganzen Geschichte gemacht.
There's another sequence where you see some Berlin Jews at a party in smart suits with champagne and cigars, etc., and you're told, watch out, Jews don't look like this, they look like this, like the Jews in the ghetto. The film illustrates the genesis of the worldwide Jewish menace with this incredible sequence of cards showing the plagues that will destroy humanity. There are three of them, the rats, the plague, and the Jews.
Wo Ratten auch auftauchen, tragen sie Vernichtung ins Land. Auf diese Weise verbreiten sie Krankheiten, Pest, Lepra, Typhus, Cholera, Ruhr und so weiter. Sie sind hinterlistig, feige und grausam und treten meist in großen Scharen auf. Sie stellen unter den Tieren das Element der heimtückischen unterirdischen Zerstörung dar. Nicht anders als die Juden unter den Menschen.
What's more, the rat is a destructive parasite, so the Jews are both disease carriers and parasites. There's that implication too.
This horrible, inflammatory pseudo-documentary, The Eternal Jew, didn't last long in the cinemas.
The French title was The Jewish Peril. It had a screening in France. It was exactly the same with a French commentary.
Il faut se rendre compte de l'effroyable danger qui menace la civilisation. Richard Wagner a dit « Le juif est le démon plastique de la déchéance de l'humanité ». Comment ne point se souvenir de ces paroles en regardant ces visages où s'inscrit une cruelle bouffonnerie? En voilà par exemple qui ont déjà pris des habitudes un peu plus mondaines. Leur père vivait encore au ghetto, mais eux ne l'ont peut-être pas connu. Ici, dans la deuxième et la troisième génération, l'assimilation est presque parfaite. Ressembler au peuple qui les héberge, tel est le mot d'ordre. Même ceux que l'on appelle les vieux aristocrates israélites, qui, par des alliances avec une noblesse en dégénérescence, appartiennent depuis des générations au milieu dit de haute société, sont restés des corps étrangers et doivent être considérés comme tels.
Comparons le juif à un rat.
Ils portent avec eux la destruction, anéantissent les biens et les vivres, propagent d'effroyables maladies. Ils sont rusés, lâches, cruels, et ils surgissent le plus souvent en masses énormes.
Films like that were widely denounced by some people, but of course you have ideological anti-Semites who are delighted. There was never a time when there were not anti-Semites in France.
Well, Hitler wanted to get the French to agree with him on anti-Semitism.
After the fall of France, towards the end of 1940, the beginning of 1941, when Hitler decides that his next move will be against the Soviet Union, the answer, where will the Jews go, is answered. Not the General Gouvernement, not Madagascar. Now they will go to Siberia. After Moscow is captured, after the Bolsheviks are defeated, the Jews of all of Europe will be sent to the east, will be pushed across the Urals, and they can rot, they can die, they can do anything, but they will be outside of the German sphere of influence. They will be away from the Aryan people, the German people, the Volk.
It was an important turning point in anti-Jewish politics, because for Germany, this war wasn't just about strategic objectives. It was, above all, an ideological war, in the full sense of the term. For Hitler, it was a life or death struggle.
Heydrich calls together all the heads of department, all of the officers of the head office of the SS, and he says in very broad, in very general terms, I have a special mission for you. It's going to be hard work. I can't say too much about it, but I want volunteers who are going to go with our forces into Russia to do special tasks.
The decision-making process that begins with the preparation for the invasion of the Soviet Union and ends in the summer of 1941 that seals the fate of Soviet Jewry.
The campaign that got underway on the 22nd of June 1941 was a campaign like no other. It was full-out racial war. The whole of the Nazi state and the Nazi army were preparing for this war. We have found a huge number of directives and tracts that were distributed to the German troops to prepare them for what they'd find in Russia. Reading them, you're struck by the extent to which the political and military hierarchies were gripped by an enormous anxiety at the time of this invasion. The troops must never trust the prisoners. They must never trust the locals. They might be armed. A dead body isn't always dead. Never accept any food. The USSR is the land of cruelty, of hunger and of fear. Don't touch anything, don't touch the people, don't drink the water, don't eat their vegetables, don't touch door handles. That's why they used all those flamethrowers on the Eastern Front.
When it finally came to the invasion of the Soviet Union, this was truly a joint venture between the military and the Nazis. They both wanted to crush communism. They both wanted to establish an Eastern European empire with vast resources to keep Germany as the superpower in the world.
The German attack on the Soviet Union was the ultimate act of hubris. The Nazis and the military leadership were guilty of the most extraordinary foolishness and ignorance, an abysmal dereliction of responsibility. They believed that they would destroy the Russian armies in 3 or 4 weeks.
The Soviet Union would collapse, and then he would be in Moscow by the end of the summer of 1941.
This was not just a miscalculation, it was madness.
The attack on the Soviet Union was a complete surprise. The front would stretch over 3,000 kilometers. In just a few weeks, the German armies advanced several hundred kilometers, to the north towards Leningrad, to the center towards Moscow, to the south towards Kiev and the Black Sea. For Himmler, the war against the Soviet Union was a fight to the death between National Socialism and Communism, between the Aryan race and the slaves and the Jews. German troops occupied Belorussia and a large part of the Ukraine. The Wehrmacht, within its wake, the 900-strong Einsatzgruppen A, advanced into the Baltic states. Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, which had been annexed and incorporated into the USSR in 1939. The Soviet occupation had been merciless, and many welcomed the Germans as liberators.
For the native populations, the Ukrainians, the Lithuanians, this is viewed. The Nazis come and say, we're out to get rid of Jews and Bolsheviks. This makes perfect sense in the mind of the locals who have experienced the last 2 years as a Bolshevik regime supported and welcomed by the Jews. And you have this explosion of resentment and frustration and rage that the Nazis stir up and approve.
When in early July 1941 the Germans arrived in the town of Kaunas, the murder of Jews in pogroms became widespread as the local population began to massacre them, beating them to death with iron bars. From the very first days of the German invasion, the Lithuanian population took part in dreadful massacres.
They initially hoped that they would stir up pogroms, and they certainly had orders to do that. And what they increasingly find is that it is more productive, more organized, more controllable if, instead of simply stirring up pogroms, they recruit local people into a controlled auxiliary police. And some people come to volunteer to the Germans very early.
They saw the Jews as being strong allies of the communists. The German propaganda, it emphasized this point, and it rekindled some of the anti-Semitism that was there before with perhaps a new edge now that the Germans were definitely rewarding those who took part in the anti-Semitic activities.
Most of them were armed with rifles, as you can see in the film I shot. A Lithuanian with an iron bar was hitting a man on the skull. In 3/4 of an hour, he had beaten 50 people to death. The local people there, their behavior was incredible. They were applauding each death. The ones who were pulling the strings in the shadow of Bolshevism were the Jews. So, with this argument, the Jews now found themselves, in the Nazis' mind, right in the firing line and a principal target. The Soviet powers that be were taken by surprise by the speed of the German invasion and found themselves with the German army advancing on them like a tsunami, and their own prisons full of freedom fighters, if you can call them that, and Ukrainian, Latvian, Lithuanian and Belarusian nationalists, who all professed ideas that were ideologically astonishingly close to those of National Socialism, and who were just as anti-Semitic as the Nazis. And they didn't know what to do with these prisoners. The only solution was obviously to execute them.
Mit Messern, Äxten, Handgranaten und Maschinengewehren wurden diese unschuldigen Opfer bolschewistischer Mordgier grausam gemartert und hingeschlachtet.
The first thing the Nazis would find was great mounds of the corpses of Ukrainian nationalists, with always 1 or 2 survivors left there to tell them it was the Jews who did it. So these Einsatzgruppen men, who, like everyone in the Wehrmacht, had been told they were going into an incredibly cruel country of violence and anguish, the first violence they would experience wasn't shooting people themselves, but the violence of others.
podczas którego kilka tysięcy osób zostało zamordowanych po prostu.
Thousands of people were killed in the streets. In Lvov, it was only the Ukrainians involved in this pogrom. The Germans simply filmed it or took photographs. When news of the massacre reached Lublin, many were horrified because many of the town's Jews had relatives in Lvov. They couldn't believe it was possible to kill so many people in so short a time. The Jews had heard about the pogroms, but nobody imagined there could be so many dead, that entire communities could just disappear.
The civil and military authorities organized the total economic exploitation of the occupied territories. During the first weeks of the invasion, this consisted of the deportation to Germany of forced labor, of workers from the east, over 4 million of them. The Wehrmacht generals had no scruples about ordering whole villages to be deported and all the men arrested. Reduced to slavery, they became nothing but a labor pool for the benefit of the Reich. Families were brutally separated, with the women and children chased off to regions where temperatures reached -30 or -40 degrees. In the Soviet Union, from the very start, the Wehrmacht were pillaging all around them. Thousands of villages were entirely stripped of all their food supplies. Hitler's instructions were very clear. They should let the whole population die of hunger. We shall take everything of use to us. Goering was no less frank. I intend to loot and pillage effectively. Tens of thousands of Russians shall die of hunger, and perhaps it is better so, since certain nations must be decimated. The Wehrmacht systematically devastated all the villages it passed through, leaving men, women, and children destitute, condemned to starvation.
The Nazi hierarchy decided that the Eastern Army that was invading Russia would not get any supplies from Germany. It was supposed to feed itself from the land.
There was not enough food in the Third Reich to supply the people of Germany and the 4 million men in Russia. The 4 million men of the German armed forces were going to be fed from the food that was available in Russia. Now that was only possible if the Russians starved, and if Russian Jews starved, or if they were killed.
The Wehrmacht's logistics experts knew very well that this tactic would condemn tens of millions of people to starvation. It's there in the documents. Tens of millions of individuals must die of famine. That meant starving to death the populations of entire cities. Essentially, these urban populations were Jewish. They were already committed to a tactic of starvation and of the forced extinction of the race by logistical and economic choices that had already been carried out by others before them. So they were already heading for a sort of politics of indirect extermination. People had to die.
In the early months of the invasion, the idea that that the Nazis will be able to carry out a total and systematic annihilation of Soviet Jewry, I think crystallizes, and Hitler more or less gives his nod of the head, the green light to this in July of 1941.
Hitler has a big meeting at the Führer headquarters, and a number of the top Nazi leaders are there. At this meeting, Hitler was basically giving out guidelines for the pacification of the Eastern territories and how these territories would be controlled. And Hitler had said at this meeting, if anybody even looks a bit askance, he needs to be exterminated. So very brutal directives were given by Hitler, but in these broad terms.
There was never any written order to exterminate the Jews. None.
Himmler was then obviously given his mandate then to pacify by whatever means necessary these eastern territories.
Das Judenviertel von Jonava, das gleichfalls nach dieser Anordnung verschont wurde, wird gesäubert. Auch hier terrorisierte das jüdische Gesindel im Bunde mit den GPU-Agenten die litauische Bevölkerung in der furchtbarsten Weise. Die jüdische Bevölkerung Baltis wird in Sammellager gebracht. Das sind jene Ostjudentypen, die besonders nach dem Weltkriege die Großstädte Mittel- und Westeuropas überschwemmten,
wo sie als Parasiten ihre Gastvölker zersetzten und tausendjährige Kulturen zu vernichten drohten. Wo sie auch auftauchten, brachten sie Verbrechen, Korruption und Chaos.
For Hitler, it must have been an apocalyptic war, not only with the aim of conquering territories, but above all, of crushing the main enemy, those propagators of Jewish thinking, the Jewish Bolsheviks.
By destroying what he called Jewish Bolshevism, you would at the same time acquire living space, Lebensraum. So the attack on the Soviet Union was meant the destruction of the Jews as well as it did securing Germany's future. So in this way, the removal of the Jews and the destruction of the Jews is absolutely central to the war itself.
Himmler and the SS and the army negotiate agreement. And according to this agreement, 4 SS units, known as Einsatzgruppen, A, B, C, and D, from the Baltic to the Black Sea, will have the right to travel all the way up to the front lines, to advance with the army as it moves forward. They will receive their logistical support from the military. The trucks, gasoline, food, bullets, all what they need to operate, the army provides. The orders who they're to kill will come from Berlin and from Himmler and Heydrich.
Heydrich assembled the commanders of the Einsatzgruppen and Einsatzkommandos and told them, "Your mission in the Soviet Union will be the elimination of the Jews and the communist leaders."
Above all, carrying out this operation was not easy to organize. Rounding up the Jews, finding suitable places to dig the necessary mass graves, and getting them to the killing grounds. "We've held on to a few Jews," one report said. "We'll still need them till the end of winter."
The men of the Einsatzgruppen weren't chosen for their appetite for killing or their experience. These were young men of 19 or 20, no more. Before joining the Einsatzgruppen, they weren't born killers. At their first shootings, they didn't know what to do. Sometimes they were even sickened by it.
There is a general, as I use the word, acclimatization to the terror that was being inflicted upon the Jews.
In the first towns, the Einsatzgruppen would kill a dozen or more people. 1 week later, it was 60 or 70. A week after that, 130 or 140. The Einsatzgruppen shot them by the hundreds. They very quickly, within 3 weeks, had acquired the skill to carry out the 2 basic Nazi requirements: to kill a lot and to kill efficiently, and quickly, of course. So a system was soon evolved, one based on the division of labour. On the one hand, one group of them would guard the victims-to-be, another detail would lead them to the pits, which had already been dug, and finally, a third group were the triggermen, who put them to death. They developed a sort of anatomical know-how that permitted them to kill cleanly with a shot to the back of the neck.
These Einsatzgruppen units were all quite small. In the smallest of them, Group D, there were 600 men. In the largest, less than 1,500. In other words, the size of a battalion. Altogether, the Einsatzgruppen consisted of just 3,000 men.
Still quite small in number. You can't carry out a mass genocide with that number of people who've been sent in on the 22nd of June.
There was already hundreds of thousands of Jews being killed by these special killing squads, and sometimes the German army adding in too.
In the German Army's directives for Operation Barbarossa, there was one article that stipulated that the German army, the Wehrmacht, had to support Himmler and his troops in the Soviet territories and back them up. During the war in the East, there was a sort of division of labor between the Wehrmacht and the SS. The Directorate of the Wehrmacht knew very well, as did all the officers, what the Einsatzgruppen were up to there, because the massacres were flagrant and they left behind obvious traces.
The position of the mission of the Einsatzgruppen were negotiated between the SS and the Wehrmacht, and the orders given to the Einsatzgruppen all had to be approved by the Wehrmacht, which had in any case made special dispensations to exempt its own men from military justice or any form of justice for atrocities against civilians.
The Wehrmacht's High Command was completely convinced that this was a race war, a war of extermination, but it lent its hand to ensure the executions could take place.
You can see that in some regions there was a real sharing of all the hard work of genocide. In Belorussia, it was the troops of the SS and of the Einsatzgruppen B who were charged with the extermination of the Jews in the towns and cities, while the Jews of the small villages were shot by the Wehrmacht's 707 division. Without the support of various departments of the military and of the civil service, but also of the serving troops of the Wehrmacht and its logistics units, the extermination of Soviet Jews could never have been carried out so quickly and on such a scale.
They were killing male Jews in large numbers, but still not women and children. There was no total genocide in the Soviet Union.
Without, as usual, issuing any direct order, Hitler gave Himmler carte blanche in the summer of '41.
The meetings between Hitler and Himmler were not minuted. There were no notes taken. We don't have a written record of what was said. They were very careful to keep anything completely dark in that sense. But we see on a whole number of occasions Hitler says something in broad terms, which is his usual way of operating, and soon afterwards Himmler acts, and what takes place then is a drastic radicalization.
For some time now, we've had Himmler's service record, and we can see with certainty that on certain dates he was in the East, that he often visited his troops, and that each time, after his visits, the killings intensified. Himmler visited the Einsatzgruppen commanders, and they took him to see an execution at Minsk. He was present at executions several times. He was obviously there to make his men feel that, as head of the SS, he shared with them their heavy task, as he called it. At Minsk, in Belorussia, they set up an execution for him, and apparently he had trouble handling it mentally. It seems that in August, he broke down at an execution of Jews. But there's also another account of this same execution from a police officer who was there. He writes that Himmler, his face frozen, marched up to the pit and, pointing into it, coldly ordered the officer to finish off the victims who were still alive.
It's curious, though, that we still believe Himmler felt unwell and tried to avoid the shootings, since it was at the very time he was present, the 16th of August 1941 in Minsk, that he ordered his men to include the women and children, which resulted in his men establishing the most transgressive practices. Killing huge numbers of women was nothing new. They'd been doing it for at least a month. They really took a big leap, though, into something else entirely at that moment, around the 16th of August 1941, when they started killing the children. A kind of communication evolved between the trigger pullers, with two of them for each mother and child, one aiming at the child, the other the woman. They'd separate the mother and child and take one each. That's when, with the children, it turned into pure genocide.
Women and children were now being drawn into the extermination procedures, and Himmler was going out there visiting his own commanders out on the front, passing on verbal orders to them.
One by one, give to local units the direction that now they are no longer just killing adult male Jews, but they are targeting all Jews. And you see in different areas on the Western Front, from late July into September, not everywhere all at the same time, but in a kind of ripple effect as news of this spreads and as they visit different areas, a retargeting away from adult male Jews to killing all Jews.
At the first mass shooting of women and children, there were more than 3,000 killed in a single day. Thousands of children, all killed at once. It's the beginning of ethnic cleansing of Jews, of all Jews, in all the territories. Einsatzkommando 3's statistical report no longer gave any details about men, women or children. It said all the Jews.
In each area, all of them are under the higher SS and police leader for the North Front, the Central Front, or the South Front. So say in the Ukraine, you had a man named Yekeln, who was the higher SS and police leader, and he is coordinating the joint operations of the Einsatzgruppen and the order police battalions in his area, and they quite often are carrying out joint actions.
The newly appointed chief of police and head of the SS for the occupied territories, Friedrich Yekeln, decided to carry out a kind of experiment in mass extermination. Yekeln mobilized most of the troops he had in an attempt to see if, logistically, he could kill entire sectors of the population. At the same time, he was testing the motivation of his men. He stayed right by the mass graves throughout the whole of the first day of the massacre. His rambling justifications of these mass killings continued at the scene during the slaughter and throughout the dinner to which the 600 or 700 trigger pullers were invited as honoured guests.
D'un dîner réunissant les quelques 600 ou 700 personnes des formations concernées. Et c'est ainsi, si vous voulez, que...
And that's how, on the first day, this bunch of murderers very likely executed almost 15,000 people.
Exécuté pratiquement 15,000 personnes.
And then the 8,000 survivors had to sleep among the carnage, to be executed themselves the next day.
To make Germany strong and great again, you can't afford to be compassionate. That is the mentality of the Einsatzgruppen, working with Himmler and Heydrich. And I think this helps to explain why they don't have much of a problem with mass murder on a vast scale.
That was when the extermination became general. At Vilnius, at Babi Yar, they began the total extermination of the Jews. Men, women, children, it didn't matter.
A poster on the wall. Jews of Kiev and its region, on the 29th of September, you will assemble with your personal effects, money, papers, and warm clothing by the Jewish cemetery. Any absentee will be punished by death. At dawn, Jews from all over Kiev started walking to the cemetery. Many of them were expecting to be shipped to the provinces. Some families had baked bread for the journey. Others had rented carts. People were dragging parcels and suitcases. The whole city was silent. In the distance, the stripped hills, the sheer ravines.
Over 33,000 Jews, men, women, and children murdered in 2 days by the Einsatzgruppen on 29-30 September 1941, which was the Jewish high holidays, in a little ravine, a place called Babi Yar.
I had to go right down into those gorges with my comrades. The shooters had been in 3 groups of about 12 men. The Jews were all put together in front of the firing squad, and the ones behind had to lie down on the bodies of the ones who'd just been shot. The soldiers stood behind them and killed them with a bullet in the back of the neck. I remember they were just overcome with horror when they got to the edge of the pit and saw all the bodies. A lot of them started screaming.
This was such a huge event. So many German military personnel, Wehrmacht, Luftwaffe, service personnel were involved, were around this, saw it, heard about it, who then went home on leave or wrote about it home, that this event became very widely known.
Bit by bit, the news got through to the Americans, to London, and of course to Moscow.
All of Europe hears about a huge massacre like the one at Babi Yar.
An Israeli newspaper ran an article. 33,000 people killed in just a few days at Babi Yar. The next day, everyone was outraged. Are they crazy, this paper? What are they on about? 33,000 in a few days? That's practically impossible. So the paper put out a communiqué. We apologize. We made a mistake and added a 0. In fact, there were 3,300 victims. A few days later, at the end of an article on the Holocaust, the paper wrote, "The reader is responsible for reading. If you wish to read this, it is your own responsibility."
On the 16th of October 1941, more than 1,000 Jews from the city of Lubny in the Ukraine were assassinated by an Einsatzgruppen C unit. Johannes Heller, of the propaganda company charged with following the German army, took these few photos just before the killings.